The New York Giants offense struggled during Monday's practice, and I have a thought or two about that, plus a thought or two about the Jets' decision to play Aaron Rodgers Saturday night in the preseason finale. All that and more coming up on today's Locked On Giants podcast next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. My name is Patricia Traina, credentialed member of the New York Giants media, 30 years plus on the beat, and I am your host for today's podcast, as well as every day here on the Locked On Giants podcast. Special shout out to my everydayers and to my newcomers and everybody in between. You are appreciated. You are loved. And today's episode of the Locked On Giants podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. And folks, on today's show, we're going to talk about Monday's practice. The Giants back at work after having Sunday off. So we'll talk a little bit about it. We'll talk about the Jets' decision to play Aaron Rodgers in the preseason finale on Saturday and what that means for the Giants. And then we'll close things out by talking about the over-under as set by our friends over at FanDuel and the over-under for Giants wins this season. I'm going to tell you what that number is. And I'm going to also give you my 2 cents as to whether you should take the over or the under. So that is today's agenda. Again, so happy to have you with us on the Locked On Giants podcast. And thank you all for the wonderful comments that you send over on the YouTube channel, for the subtext community, for your comments and suggestions. And by the way, I know somebody asked me about, commenting about Aaron Rodgers and, could I get it into a podcast? And I had responded that I wrote about it over on Giants Country, but I'm also going to talk about it here on the podcast because I do listen to you guys and gals. So if there's something in particular you want to hear on the podcast, I do try to work it in. So anyway, let's get to the practice report. The Giants offense on Monday. Yikes. Wow. To say it was a rough day would be putting it nicely. The defense basically lived in the backfield for the Giants. There were sacks, there were pressures, and this was coming up against the first team offensive line. We saw stunts that were coming in that, weren't picked up, all kinds of fancy blitzes and stuff like that. And folks, I have a take on this. I'm going to throw it out for what it's worth. You may or may not agree with me, and that's fine. But this is a concern I've had now for, I want to say at least over a week, maybe even longer. At some point, you've got to settle on that offensive line. Now, I get what Brian Dable and the coaching staff is trying to do. They want to see various combinations because you never know when injury is going to happen. You never know when, you might have to plug Ben Bredesen in at center, or Mark Lewinsky needs to come off the bench and maybe you plug in Joshua Zudo at right guard. So they want to see what they've got. But at some point, if you were to ask any offensive line coach, if you were to ask any offensive lineman what their preference was as far as, playing with the same guys next to them or mixing and matching, they'll tell you that they prefer to have the same guy next to them at, from down to down, snap to snap. And the Giants really haven't been able to do that this summer. And again, a part of that is to see what they've got, because the only way you're going to see what you got is if you mix and match. But, when you see, for example, Mark Lewinsky, as he did today, playing left guard, and, Ben Bredesen flipping over to right guard, and now all of a sudden Ben Bredesen, who, is playing next to Evan Neal, and now they can't pick up a stunt, that's a problem. And the coaching staff will say, well, better it be done in practice in a controlled environment. Okay, I get that. But what about building up continuity? What about building up communication? there's communication and there's nonverbal communication. And I don't know just how far along that offensive line is with regards to that. And, I know the question was asked of Dable, I want to say a couple weeks ago, and he basically said, look, I don't have a time frame as to when I'm going to cut it off and say, okay, these are my starting five. I'm going to keep looking until I'm sure. And I get it. Look, the offensive line, it is one of the most important positions on the field because, look, doesn't matter who your quarterback is, who your running back is. It doesn't matter who your receivers are. If your offensive line is garbage, your offense is not going to hum like a well-oiled machine. So it's important to make sure you've got the right guys out there. I get that. It's also important to make sure you have the right guys for depth. Who's going to be the third tackle? Who's going to be the backup center? Who's going to be the backup guards? I get all that. But my gosh, they've been at this since the spring. All right. Now, granted, in the spring, they weren't working in pads. They've been in pads now since the start of the month. You got to have some idea what you want to do. You can't sit there and say, oh, I'm still trying to figure it out. I got to think they have an idea. And, are they trying different combinations again, just as a clever way of saying, okay, we're just going to get these guys work? Possible. Are they planning to take the rotation into, the regular season? Well, it wouldn't be the first time a coaching staff did it, but gosh, I sure hope not. But, it's also a catch-22 because they have young guys. Joshua Zudo is a guy that, they want to get reps. And the only way you get them reps is if they play, if they practice. So, that's kind of what the preseason is for. And, I wonder sometimes how much the loss of the fourth preseason game factors into this, because you sure do see a lot of rotation going late into training camp. And I'm not so sure that that's the best way to go, but I understand why they do it. Maybe I'm just impatient. I don't know, but I sure would like to know, okay, who's going to be the starting five? Now, I do think it's going to be Andrew Thomas. I think it's going to probably be Ben Bredesen at left guard. John Michael Schmitz has the center spot down, which we all knew. That's not a surprise. At right guard, it's going to be Glowinski. I'd be stunned if it wasn't. And right tackle, it's going to be Evan Neal, who, by the way, was particularly struggling against Kayvon Thibodeau on Monday. So, just at some point, though, let everybody gel and settle in together. How much more experimenting can you do? Unless, they're just doing it to get these guys experience, or are they just kind of just saying, we really don't know. And I find it hard to believe that they really don't know at this point. They got to have an idea. This is the last week of training camp. At some point you got to say, okay, this is going to be our line. Now, here's another possibility. Maybe, just maybe, they're mixing and matching to keep Dallas on edge. Maybe it's a strategic move. That could very well be. I wouldn't put that past Brian Dable. Maybe he knows who the five are going to be. And maybe come next week when the full practices are closed to the media, they'll, mix and match on that, during the open part of the practice to the media. And then once we get kicked out, then they go to the true offensive line. But the point being is, at some point, the more reps those guys can get together, the better. And you only have so many hours during the day to really work on all that stuff on the field. So I don't know. I don't know what to make of it other than, it was kind of disheartening to know that, the first team offensive line had its struggles against the first team defense. But hopefully they clean it up. Maybe it was just a bad day at the office. We'll have to see how it all works out. All right, folks, coming up next, the Jets made a decision. And how is that decision going to impact the Giants and what they do? I'll tell you right after this. Hey, Giant fans, if you want to secure tickets to your favorite concert shows and sporting events without the stress, then you need to check out Game Time, the fast and easy way to buy tickets right up until the day of the event. With amazing deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun that you're going to have. With Game Time, you not only get the lowest prices guaranteed, you also get clear images of the seats and event cancellation protection. And if you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So go ahead and snag the tickets without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Terms and conditions apply. Again, that code is LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. And this Saturday, the New York Giants and New York Jets meet in the Snoopy Bowl. It's actually no longer really the Snoopy Bowl because I don't think they have the trophy anymore. It's more or less for bragging rights in the preseason. But you know what? The Giants and the Jets are going to face each other in the regular season anyway. So preseason is like, who cares, right? But that being said, the Jets made a decision reportedly that obviously has a lot of people wondering, how is this going to affect the Giants and what they do in the preseason finale against the Jets? The decision made by the Jets, reportedly again, as first reported by the New York Post, is that they are going to play quarterback Aaron Rodgers, in the game on Saturday night. Now, this would be the first time Aaron Rodgers is going to play in a preseason game since 2018 when he was a member of the Packers. So naturally, if Aaron Rodgers is going to play, and since then I think a few other sources or reports have come out confirming it, the natural assumption is the Jets are also going to play their first team offensive line, their first team skill position players, maybe even their first team defense. And oh, by the way, you know what? The Jets have a pretty good roster, so they would be a really good test for the Giants, you would think, if they wanted to see you use that as a litmus test as opposed to, going up last week against the Carolina team that's kind of in transition. So naturally the question came up, with the Jets likely planning to roll out all their starters here, whether it be for a quarter or 2 quarters, whatever they're going to do. How will the Giants respond? Will they play their starters? And Brian Daboll has not made any announcements regarding what he's doing. All right. At this point, we've been through this is going to be the 6th preseason game with Daboll. We pretty much know at this point he's not going to come right out and say, okay, I'm playing the starters for a quarter or whatever. He keeps that on the wraps. They decide on that, on the night before a game, which also happens to be a day in which the media doesn't have access. So we don't get to talk to Daboll the night before a game, obviously. Folks, I don't think the Giants are going to play their starters against the Jets on Saturday for a few reasons. All right. Number one, Daboll is not going to let any team necessarily dictate to him how he deploys his personnel in the preseason. All right. If he does, then something's radically wrong. Number 2, the Giants and the Jets are going to face each other in the regular season. All right. I think at the end of October. So if you're the Giants, why would you want to put your starters out there and show some of these formations that you've been working on, during training camp? Why would you want to do that? Now, yes, the Giants have kept things vanilla. I get it. But there are certain formations that, coaches can pick up and certain tendencies and stuff like that, and certain hints that they can pick up, Plus, it's a chance to get some advanced scouting on some of the starters and how they're being deployed. So why would you want to give your opponent a competitive advantage like that? All right. Number 3, Daboll still has some decisions to make at the bottom of the roster. All right. So why would you want to put out there your starters for even a quarter and take away opportunities for guys that you're still trying to evaluate, guys that you want to be sure before you tell them, on August 29th, hey, sorry, you're not making the roster. You want to be sure. of what you see. You want to give them every last chance. And there are plenty of guys that need this Jets game to convince the Giants that, they're either worthy of a roster spot or a spot on the practice squad. So that's where Dable's concern is, and rightfully so. It's not about matching up with the Jets. It's not about even beating the Jets. It's about figuring out the best 53 and then the best, what is it, 16 now for the practice squad? That's what it's all about for Dable. All right, great. Aaron Rodgers is playing. I already know what my lead story is going to be for Saturday night. So, wonderful. But for Dable, again, he doesn't care. And folks, here's the other important thing that I don't think a lot of people are taking into consideration when they say, "Oh my God, Aaron Rodgers is playing." Folks, preseason games can be rough. All right. Let's look around the NFC East, for example. Dallas had a couple of season-ending injuries, torn ACLs to I think it was Overshone and one of their tight ends. I think it was Stevens. Both of them had torn ACLs. The Eagles had some guys get banged up. All right. Do we really want to see the Giants putting their starters out there in a meaningless game against a Jets defense, for example, the Giants offense against the Jets defense? That's really pretty good and physical. Do we really want to see that? I don't. Last week when Darren Waller was playing, I kept saying after every catch, I'm like, get him off the field, get him off the field. We know what he could do. The coaches know what he could do. So they got him a few reps. Great. They knocked off any rust. But you know what? This whole concept about, there being rust and worrying about that, I'm not so sure that that's as big of a deal. I'd be more concerned if the starters hadn't played at all during the preseason, but they've been getting some quality reps in practice. The coaches have been trying to simulate a game tempo as best as they can in practice, albeit in a controlled environment. So I'm not as concerned, about the Giants coming out on September 10th against the Cowboys and looking rusty. Just not. So, those are a few reasons why, great, Aaron Rodgers is playing. I'm looking forward to seeing it. I mean, look, Aaron Rodgers is going to the Hall of Fame one day. Great quarterback, a lot of fun to watch. But you know what? You take it all with a grain of salt. It's preseason. Nobody cares about the outcome of the game. Nobody's going to sit there and marvel over the stats. Now, I mentioned I already have my post-game story written. Actually, I don't have it written, but I know what I'm going to do over on Giants Country. And that's basically, how did the Giants depth players stack up against the Jets starters? That's going to be the story as far as I'm concerned. Because the depth, when you look at this Giants team and you look at, the last two preseason games and how there has been such a fall off when you get from, the starters to the second team to the third team and the fourth team, that to me is where the story is. Can this depth that is the third team, for example, is there anybody worth salvaging to add to the roster? And that all ties back to what I was saying before about Brian Dable not worrying about, oh my God, we've got to counteract. We've got a game plan against Rodgers because we can't have him beat us. Folks, didn't they beat Rodgers and the Packers last year in London in a regular season game? So, with all due respect, Rodgers is beatable. But again, it's not about the final score. I've said this at the start of preseason. I've said this last week. I'll say it again. The final score doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. If the Giants, they win, great. If they don't, who cares? This bragging rights of New York, talk to me in October. That's when we can determine preliminary bragging rights. And then talk to me again at the end of the season when we see who's in the playoffs and who's not. And if both teams are in the playoffs, see who goes the furthest. All right. Then you can talk about bragging rights. So that's how I see it. No big deal. But it'll be fun. It'll be fun to see Aaron Rodgers with the Jets. So, all right, folks, coming up next, over under for Giant wins that's set by our friends over at FanDuel. I'm going to tell you what that number is, and I'm going to tell you whether you should take the over or the under and why. So don't go anywhere. Hey, Giant fans, our partner at eBay Motors has teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week, all season long. Whether you're prepping for a draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you with players that are guaranteed to fit on your roster. And Giant fans, if you're looking for a player to take in fantasy football drafts who will spark his new team's offense and also help you to speed to victory, then you'll want to consider using a luxury pick on the Giants' very own tight end, Darren Waller. The former Raider is already riding in style again with Daniel Jones locked into him all throughout training camp and the preseason. And folks, let me tell you, as someone who has been there at training camp and seen Darren Waller and Daniel Jones and that connection, Waller has come as advertised. With his elite speed and ability to draw and win in a crowd, Waller is one of the most exciting players his team has had on offense since the addition of running back Saquon Barkley. And that connection, ladies and gentlemen, between Waller and Jones is strong enough already to believe that Waller will go back to being a reliable cog at his position. So go on and grab him after the top few tight ends are off the board and ride to victory in your weekly fantasy games with this guaranteed fit for your lineup. And Giant fans, if you're looking for a guaranteed fit for your vehicle, you need to check out eBay Motors. With over 122 million parts and accessories for your vehicle right at your fingertips, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Air filters, brakes, batteries, taillights, alternators, shocks, struts, you name it, eBay Motors has it. And they'll make sure it's the right fit for your car because eBay's guaranteed fit helps you to understand exactly what part you need for your vehicle. So go forth, switch gears, crank up the AC, and say goodbye to sweating when your ride needs a little fixing up. Because with eBay's guaranteed fit, everything you need for your vehicle is just a click away. For the parts and accessories that fit your vehicle, just look for the green check. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices at ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay's guaranteed fit, only available to U.S. customers, eligible items only, exclusions apply. Welcome back, everybody, to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. Happy to have you with us on this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Giants podcast. And in this segment, we're going to do something a little different. I don't normally do this on the show, but I'm going to do it because, I found it interesting. Our friends over at FanDuel have set an over-under for the number of wins for the New York Giants 2023 season. So let me just, for those of you who are watching on YouTube, I'm just going to pop this graphic on the screen. So the New York Giants win total odds as set by FanDuel, the number is 7.5. All right. So the over is at minus 106, and it looks like the under is at, it looks like minus 118. So the over under again, 7.5. Now, I got to be honest with you, folks. I don't understand how odds are set. How does a team win half of a game? I'm not really sure how that works. But here's what I will say to you. For the, a lot of places are picking the Giants to not match last year's win total of 9. I don't really understand why. Now, I guess maybe it has to do with the schedule, which is a lot harder than last year's schedule. If you want to go by, what I call the phantom strength of the schedule statistic. And, I call it a phantom statistic because quite honestly, it doesn't mean anything. The teams that they faced or they're going to face this year, they're not the same team they were last year. So, we've seen instances where teams were at the bottom of the barrel and then they rose up the charts and suddenly they were powerhouses. So strength of the schedule to me, it doesn't mean anything. All right. So that being said, you look at the first part of the Giants schedule and you say, oh my God, they're on the road a lot. They've got 4 of their first 5 primetime games in the first half of the schedule. Holy moly. What are they going to do? Guys, here's the thing. The schedule is what it is. All right. We all knew who the Giants were going to play We knew that at the end of last year. All right. We didn't know the order, granted, but eventually the order had to come in place. It had to fall into place, which it has since done. Now, the problem I have with trying to forecast schedules, and this is a big reason why I don't really like to do shows where I sit here and I predict, okay, what are the Giants going to do in week 1? What are they going to do in week 2? And make those predictions, like when the schedule comes out. There are so many factors that go into it. I'd rather do a prediction, the week of a game, because this way I know the injury history, or the injury report. I have an idea on the matchups. I have an idea of, the tendencies and trends. It just becomes a little bit easier, I think, to make an educated guess. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be right all the time, but it becomes, your information is more thorough, and it's just, you can make a more educated guess, like I said. So anyway, 7.5 wins for the Giants. I don't think I agree with that, folks. I think I take the over. And I'll tell you why I would take the over if I were a betting person. Number one, now assuming that the team stays healthy, okay, this offense is going to be so much better than it was last year. And last year it wasn't horrible, considering that, they had some question marks at receiver, considering that they had to rely solely on Saquon Barkley to generate a lot of the offensive production and Daniel Jones to generate a lot of the offensive production. That will not be the case this year if everybody's healthy. They will be able to spread the ball around. So the offense now becomes a little trickier to defend. And oh, by the way, we've seen some creative looks from the offense that will probably make it into the playbook. All right. Good luck, for example, if you are the Dallas Cowboys trying to figure out who from the trip formation, which means, 3 receivers, or a combination of receivers, tight ends, running backs, bunched up, on one side of the formation. Good luck trying to figure out who the pass target's going to be. All right. This isn't the days of, when Odell Beckham Jr. was here and everybody and their uncle knew that the ball was going to go to Odell. Right. Those days are gone. All right. So that's one thing. And then, the coaching, I mentioned that. You look at how much that this coaching staff got out of the team last year, how they overachieved and how they optimized everything. And you got to feel good about the Giants winning at least 9 games. You just got to, because, they did it last year. Now, here's where I would be concerned, as far as an over under, and they, FanDuel, I didn't get this number regarding within the division. But for me, I want to see the Giants win in the division. All right. I don't think they've won in the division in a few years now. I think last year they had a losing record in division games. That's got to change. If this team wants to win the division, they got to start with their division opponents. If this team, wants to get a higher playoff seeding, they got to start winning their division games. That's the litmus test for me. All right. So that opening day game against Dallas, huge. Because if the Giants come out flat as day old soda, we got a problem. If the Giants look overmatched, we got a problem. All right. So if the Giants, if they can stand toe to toe with the Cowboys, beat the Cowboys up, then I'm going to be feeling pretty good about things. So that's, to me, the most important litmus test. That's going to set the tone for the season, because look, it'll be early on, and some people will say, well, you don't really know what kind of team you're going to have until like the 3rd or 4th week of the season. I want to know week 1. And I think the coaching staff wants to know week 1. I mean, that argument is applicable if you're just inheriting a new team or rebuilding a team from scratch. It's not applicable, I think, this year. All right. So that week 1 game is going to set the tone. And, people say to me, well, then they got to go out on the road for 2 weeks in a row, and they've got Arizona and then San Francisco. Folks, I'd be happy if they had a split there, beat the Cardinals, which they should. Frisco's going to give them trouble. But if they could, again, stand toe to toe, because eventually, if they do get to the playoffs, these are the teams they're going to have to face in the playoffs. This is the caliber of football they're going to have to face. If they could stand toe to toe and not be blown out of the water, then I think you feel pretty good about, where this Giant team is. All right. So, you can go on down the line. And again, I'm not going to go into a game by game prediction, but I do think that the Giants are going to win at least 9 games, possibly 10 games this year. I will go on the record as saying that if everybody's healthy, given the coaching staff, given the creativity, given some of what we've seen, some of what I know that's coming down the pipe, I feel good about the Giants having a double-digit win season. I would not say that is out of the possibility. All right. The Giants, as is the case every year, there are going to be games that they have no business winning, and they do. And there's going to be games where they should win, and they don't. We see it every year. But over under, folks, if I were a betting person, I would take the over on that 7.5 win total from our friends at FanDuel. My take, my opinion, I don't profess to be a gambling expert. So, if you want to take my advice, great. If you don't, up to you. But I think the 7.5 win total sells the Giants way short of what they are capable of doing. So we'll see. All right, everybody, that's going to do it for this edition of the Locked On Giants podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day, or watching on YouTube, your first watch of the day. I'll be back tomorrow with more coverage of your New York Football Giants.